Hello and welcome. I'm Rawia Alami and this is the Dailies, where we take a look at important news stories, reports, analyses and articles published in newspapers and media outlets across the world. Two international stories led global headlines today. Israel's ground offensive in Gaza, launched as a UN commission, concludes that Israel has committed genocide, and Donald Trump's arrival in the UK for his second state visit, a moment of pomp shadowed by political tension. Alongside these developments, international media paused to honor the life and legacy of Robert Redford, the Hollywood icon remembered for his charm and influence on generations of cinema goers, died at his Utah home at the age of 89. We'll start from the UK, where British press are busy covering the commencement of President Trump's state visit to Britain. The Daily Mirror splashed the visit under the headline, "The Ego has landed," framing the trip as a mix of royal pageantry and fierce public anger. The piece describes 50 protesters gathering outside Windsor Castle on his arrival, branding the US president dangerous and a maniac. Amnesty International condemned Trump's policies as enabling genocide in Gaza, while banners linking him to Jeffrey Epstein added further controversy. The report highlights that despite the backlash, Trump is receiving full A-list treatment, a Windsor banquet, parades and fly-pasts, making him the only US president to be granted 2 state visits. The Times cartoon pokes fun at the awkward mood around Trump's UK state visit. The scene, as you can see, shows Trump, King Charles and Prime Minister Keir Starmer at a fancy banquet, but all eyes are drawn upwards to the giant floating balloon of Peter Mandelson in his underwear. The cartoon highlights how Mandelson's scandal and his links to Epstein have stolen attention from the pageantry. It suggests that instead of showcasing British dignity, the visit is being overshadowed by political embarrassment. In a sharply worded critique, London Mayor Sadiq Khan accused US President Donald Trump of fueling far-right extremism worldwide, calling his tactics straight out of the autocrat's playbook. The remarks were published in an exclusive interview done by The Guardian and coincided with Trump's arrival in Britain for a second state visit, already overshadowed by protests and the collapse of a UK-US trade deal on steel and aluminum. Khan urged British leaders to reject Trump's politics of fear and division, arguing silence only emboldens hate. His comments also followed a massive far-right march in London, fronted by Tommy Robinson and amplified by Elon Musk, which has intensified debate about the UK government's response. Edward Luce in the Financial Times argues that British leaders, particularly Prime Minister Keir Starmer, risk over-relying on flattery to manage Donald Trump during his unprecedented second state visit. While Britain has secured small wins such as lower tariffs and possible whiskey exemptions, Luce stresses that Trump's admiration lies with monarchy and class, not with Britain's democratic system. Unlike Canada or India, which hedge with new alliances, Britain clings to the illusion of shared values. Trump's true affinities, the article notes, are with figures like Nigel Farage and the MAGA right. The piece also warns that Britain's short-term tactics of appeasing Trump could undermine its long-term interests, leaving it vulnerable to the disruptive politics Trump and his allies embody. American media followed the presidential state visit to the UK as well. The Washington Post published an analysis looking at how the visit is set against a world in turmoil. The piece contends that the US and the UK now appear diminished after they were once pillars of global order. Now they seem to be unable to steer conflicts in Ukraine, Gaza, or the Middle East. The visit also comes amid deep unpopularity for both Trump and Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and scandals linking figures close to them with Jeffrey Epstein. Analysts say the pomp of royal ceremonies at Windsor and Chequers cannot mask divisions over tariffs, Palestine, and NATO. And the analysis concludes that unlike past eras, today Trump's unpredictability and lack of diplomatic groundwork cast doubt on whether this visit will deliver more than just fleeting pageantry. To the Middle East now, as while most international press reported on UN Commission findings that Israel committed genocide in Gaza, and as Israel widens its ground offensive in the Strip, the New York Times highlights how President Trump's hands-off stance is giving Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu a de facto green light to escalate the Gaza offensive. The analysis argues that unlike the Biden administration, which conditioned military support on civilian protections, Trump has avoided pressing Israel, saying little beyond vague calls for peace. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's recent visit underscored the shift. He voiced support for Israel's goals, avoided criticism over civilian casualties, and skipped talks with Palestinian officials. The piece also underscores what critics argue, that this laissez-faire diplomacy undermines U.S. leverage and risks prolonging the war. It concludes with allies now moving towards recognizing a Palestinian state. The pressure may soon force Trump to reconsider his free pass approach to Netanyahu. Arab and international media continue to focus on the aftermath of the Israeli strike on Qatar and the subsequent extraordinary Arab Islamic summit that took place in Doha on Monday. Mamdouh Al-Mhani wrote in Al-Sharq Al-Awsat arguing that despite public anger after Israel's strike in Doha, Gulf states are unlikely to abandon Washington. The author contends that, like Europe, Japan, and South Korea, they see the U.S. alliance as a strategic necessity and not as a sentimental choice. History shows this pattern, from saving Kuwait in 1991 to countering al-Qaeda and deterring Iran. U.S. power remains the backbone of Gulf security. The article also highlights that calls to replace it with an Arab army are dismissed as unrealistic, while crises and policy clashes, whether over Iran, Iraq, or Trump's tariffs, have strained ties, that's for sure, but they never broke them. Al-Mhani concludes that Gulf leaders guided by realism will continue deepening relations with the U.S. because their survival and economic growth depend on it. Shirit Cohen wrote in Israel Hayom, portraying Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Gaza City campaign as his boldest and final gamble in the war against Hamas. Despite receiving backing from Donald Trump and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the author says Netanyahu is anxious about Israel's deepening diplomatic isolation, especially in Europe. She argues his warnings about the need for security self-reliance stem from past U.S. arms embargoes and the risk of sanctions. Supporters see the offensive as essential to defeating Hamas and freeing hostages. Critics warn of economic and political fallout. The piece concludes that Netanyahu is wagering his legacy on achieving long-term security through a decisive and potentially isolating military victory. In the U.S., the Miami Herald highlights a heated debate over free speech in Florida following the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. Lawmakers are pushing investigations and firings of teachers and professors who posted critical or mocking comments online. Officials like Marco Rubio and Anna Paulina Luna have called for harsh penalties, with Luna even threatening to cut federal funding for universities that don't act. Critics argue this jawboning risks crossing into constitutional coercion. Several educators have already faced suspensions or dismissals, sparking lawsuits that First Amendment experts say they are likely to win. The article warns that while outrage over offensive posts is common, the unprecedented involvement of government officials in pushing or punishing speech raises serious legal and ethical questions. And while most newspapers paid tribute to late actor Robert Redford, who passed away at age 89, the New York Post reflected on Redford's legendary allure in Hollywood, highlighting how his co-stars from Jane Fonda and Barbra Streisand to Meryl Streep openly admired him. Also, according to the piece, Streisand was said to be infatuated during The Way We Were, while Fonda admitted she was long in love with him. Also, Streep recalled falling for him during their famous Out of Africa hair washing scene. Yet, despite speculation, Redford kept his image carefully intact. Following his death at 89, tributes poured in from colleagues like Demi Moore and Michelle Pfeiffer, praising both his charm and artistry. That's it for today. Thanks for watching.